So the last thing that we're going to be doing is looking at the idea of tariffs. Um, so what happens to the domestic market when you have world trade and when you have tariffs applied to that world trade? So there's a few different steps. We start out with this basic domestic market. So you might be questioning why it's labeled demand is labeled DD and supply is labeled DS. It's because these are the domestic supply and domestic demand. So it's important to remember that this is just domestic. This is just at home. We are not looking at international things yet. And when we do, we're not going to be looking at international supply and international demand. We'll be looking at a world price. So this is just representative of the home country and its domestic supply and demand. We have our equilibrium price, we have our equilibrium quantity, all set domestically if there's no trading. Once you start importing from other countries, you now see a world price. And normally when you get this, the world price is going to be lower than your domestic price. If it's above your world price, if it's above your domestic price, then it's likely that you're actually exporting, and you won't be needing these imports. You won't be needing the tariffs. But the analysis would actually work the same, just opposite. So you can keep that in mind for foreign countries placing tariffs on us, although that's not really covered on the AP test. But in case you were wondering, it would just be the same analysis, just above equilibrium. So if you notice, you have a world price below our equilibrium. That means internationally, we can get this good for cheaper. So being rational individuals, we start importing it. Now, this does hurt domestic producers. No question about it, because they can't compete. They can't sell it at that price. Most of them can't, at least. And you're able to see that by drawing a horizontal line at the world price. And where that intersects with domestic supply and domestic demand, that shows you the quantity that's being supplied domestically is Q1 on this graph, because it's where your world price intersects with your domestic supply. So that's the only amount that the domestic market is able to supply. The world is able to supply all the way over at the demand curve at Q2. So the difference between Q1 and Q2 is the quantity that's being imported here. So that's the difference. That's the import quantity, if you will. So Q2 minus Q1. Now, what does this mean for efficiency and surpluses? Well, basically, our consumer surplus increases by a lot. Our consumer surplus used to be, if there was no trade, at our domestic equilibrium price, the demand curve, and the y-axis. That used to be consumer surplus. It is now increased because the consumer surplus is always the price consumers pay, demand curve, and the y-axis. So it's now increased, and you can see just how much larger it got. However, the producer surplus has now decreased. It used to be the domestic equilibrium price, the supply curve, and the y-axis, but now it's the world price, the supply curve, and the y-axis. So you can see how much smaller the producer surplus has gotten and how much larger the consumer surplus has gotten. So international trade, at least in certain sectors, if we are importing, is going to reduce the amount that we are producing domestically. This is kind of an obvious statement. It reduces the amount we produce domestically. Therefore, consumers gain and producers of that good lose. Now, you might be saying, well, this is terrible. We need to have tariffs. This is why we need tariffs. Basically, why do economists support this idea? Why do they support international trade if this is what happens? We hurt our domestic producers. Well, the answer is we have gained so much total surplus, so much in consumer surplus, that if we just take those resources that were being put to this market and move them into other things, specialize more. Remember, that was the whole point of international trade. You specialize. So we specialize more in other areas. Those jobs are made up in other areas. That's at least the economic theory. Now, of course, there's issues with that theory in terms of people being able to switch employment so easily, being able to move around the country, things like that. which are all things that we can talk about. But just graph-wise, and what you have to know for this, just know that consumers are gaining by a lot and producers are losing domestically. So if we place a tariff on the good, basically all you do is draw a new horizontal line, increasing your world price by the amount of the tax. So you just shift that curve upward by the amount of the tax. So now we've decreased the quantity imported, as we now have a new domestic supply quantity at Q3, and we now have a new quantity demanded domestically at Q4. So that has shrank. What does this mean for efficiency? Well, basically, consumer surplus decreases. You can see how much it shrank. It's now the new world price, which is including the tariff, the demand curve, and the y-axis. So it shrank. Producer surplus did increase because now it's at the new world price with the tariff, the supply curve, and the y-axis. So you see how much larger it got. However, the total surplus decreased, and you can tell that by the presence of, one, the fact that there's tax revenue, and two, the presence of deadweight loss. Now, this is the only time deadweight loss will look a little different. Normally, it's just one single triangle set by the quantity, the supply curve, and the demand curve. Here, it's the only time it looks different. So here, our tax revenue is quite simply the box you see here, which is the box formed by the world price with the tariff, the quantity being imported on each side, and then the old world price. You can just think of it as the area if you multiply the quantity being imported by the tariff. It's the same basic idea. The deadweight loss is the area of the triangles formed on either side of the tax revenue. You see those highlighted in yellow there. So total surplus decreased because total surplus used to include those deadweight loss triangles. Since they're not part of the surplus anymore, same with tax revenue, isn't part of the surplus anymore. As society, we have lost out on something. So that is why placing tariffs are not good for consumers. And societally, we do lose out a bit as a result of this. So to not talk about politics, this is strictly economics. We would say that societally, we are being inefficient and we are doing harm to society as a result of these tariffs. Now, to talk about priorities and who should we prioritize in terms of jobs or consumption, that's a balancing act that simply you have to do more research into. You have to figure out your politics and figure out your priorities of it. And economics just provides a basis for analysis of those things. And that's it for tariffs and world trade.